Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming out this evening, and welcome to our fourth Teach-In on climate change. This is the fourth Teach-In to take place at Politics and Prose. The idea is to have, following the election, a series of meaningful, insightful discussions about the urgent issues of our day. So far, we've covered civil rights, women's rights, and immigration. Can I just get a show of hands? Who's attended one of these before? That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming back. It spurs us to keep on doing these, and we'll know that there are many more things to come. So, of all the topics we've addressed so far in these teach-ins, perhaps nothing has consequences as far-reaching as climate change. The scientific evidence for climate change is at this point irrefutable. And in some ways it's irrelevant whether we believe in it or not, because climate change certainly believes in us. Tonight, we're fortunate to have a group of individuals with us who not only understand the science of climate change, but they also can talk about how it intersects with politics and the media, and who can give meaningful advice to anyone who takes this topic seriously. On our panel, we have Jamie Henn, the co-founder and strategic communications director of 350.org, a massive grassroots climate awareness movement that coordinates online campaigns and mass public actions around the world. He's currently busy helping to organize the People's Climate March taking place next Saturday, which prioritizes climate justice spearheaded by frontline community leadership. Dave Levitan, who's also with us tonight, is a journalist who's written about a range of scientific topics, focusing specifically on the intersection with policy and politics in publications including Scientific American and Slate. His new book is called Not a Scientist: How Politicians Mistake, Misrepresent, and Utterly Mangle Science. We have it available in the store today on a table called An Inconvenient Display, and I urge you to read a book that is as insightful as it is alarming when it comes to anti-science politics and rhetoric. Our third and final panelist is Todd Stern, who was President Obama's Special Envoy for Climate Change from 2009 to 2016. He led the US negotiating effort that culminated in the Paris Climate Agreement. As a leading architect of America's climate change strategy, Todd's perseverance and dedication to a monumental task saw the international community take significant steps to address climate change. He is now a visiting lecturer in law at Yale. Finally, our panel is moderated by Kristen Gunther. I'm sure many of you braved the rain yesterday to attend the March for Science, which saw thousands stand up for evidence-based policy making and took place in more than 600 cities around the world. As the Director of Mission Strategy at the March for Science, Kristen was responsible for laying out its clear goals and values, ensuring that a day of marching will now transform into an ongoing movement. I think having mobilized hundreds of thousands of people to take action and doing all of this as a volunteer, she deserves our sincere congratulations. And Kristen is currently a PhD candidate studying ecosystem management and ecology at the University of Wyoming. Kristen, Jamie, Todd, and Dave, thank you for taking the time to be with us tonight. And we look forward to an insightful conversation that I'm sure will make its impact felt far beyond this room. Thank you. Probably want the microphone. Yes.
Great. So we're going to start out with some opening statements from each of our panelists. So we'll just move from stage right all the way down. So let's start with Todd.
Thank you. Thanks to Politics and Prose for hosting this event. I think this whole series is terrific, and Politics and Prose occupies such an extraordinary place in the heart of intellectual Washington. So great to be here, and great to be here with my fellow panelists. I'm going to touch briefly on 4 points. The first is the importance of the Paris Agreement. The second is the scope of the challenge that we face in containing climate change. The third is the fact that from the point of view of 3 of the 4 core variables that are relevant, we absolutely can do what we need to do to solve this problem. And then the fourth is going to be on that 4th variable, which is the biggest hurdle of all, and that last one is politics. The first 3 involve policy, innovation, and financing, but I'll get to all of that. So first, Paris. Paris was, without doubt, an historic agreement. There had been efforts in effect over nearly 25 years to put together a regime that would really work, and Paris does that and represented a paradigm shift from what had come before. It applies to all countries, which previous agreements hadn't really done. It's built on what's called a nationally determined bottom-up structure, which allows each country to put forward what it's able to do, and it was essential to have that kind of structure in order to get everybody engaged. It's ambitious. It's built on robust goals in the Paris Agreement itself. It's built on essentially 5-year repeating cycles in which countries are supposed to keep ramping up the ambition of what they're doing, and a strong accountability and transparency system. It's fair from the point of view of differentiating between different countries. It's been a big bugaboo of these negotiations for a long time. So this agreement does differentiation in a fair way as between different countries of different capabilities, but not in the old firewall manner in which countries like China were basically exempted from having to do much, and that obviously wouldn't work. And then in addition, it includes a kind of hybrid legal structure, partly legally binding, partly not, again, critical to make the deal work. There is, as you may have read, a debate going on right now in the White House about whether to pull out of Paris or to stay in. Obviously, the policies that have been announced from a domestic standpoint by the Trump administration are not at all good, to put it mildly, on climate change. But despite all of those, it is really important that we stay in the Paris regime. It would be foolish. It would create all sorts of collateral damage on issues even beyond climate, and it would be harshly opposed by other countries and opposed by big business all over the country. So hopefully they will do the right thing. Second point, the scope of the challenge of what we have to do to actually contain climate change is quite dramatic. Just to give you an example, experts say that between 2/3 and 4/5 of the fossil fuels in the ground will have to stay there. Right? I mean, that is a quite remarkable statistic, and that's in order to meet the basic Paris goal of holding the average global temperature increase as compared to pre-industrial times to well below 2 degrees. Shell Oil did a big report about a year ago in which they said to reach net zero emissions sometime past 2050 in the second part of this century, the global energy system would have to go from 80% fossil fuel to about 20% fossil fuel, with those 20% with that 20% having its emissions captured by a process called carbon capture and storage, and applying to certain processes like heavy transportation and heavy industry, which Shell contends will need to have some fossil fuels. I actually doubt that. I mean, I think if you saw the recent news that Elon Musk at Tesla is planning to start to make full-size heavy-duty electric trucks, you can see, I think that we will come to a point where we're not using any fossil fuels. Third point, is this kind of dramatic change possible? And again, I think the answer is absolutely yes. From the point of view of policy, we know what to do. It's just a matter of actually executing it. We know what to do. From the point of view of financing, there's a very interesting report also done about a year ago by Citigroup, which analyzed over a 25-year horizon the cost of a low to no carbon path on the one hand and a high carbon path on the other. And guess what? The low carbon path slightly less expensive, right? And slightly less expensive because although it costs somewhat more upfront to build the infrastructure for solar and wind and all of those things, you then don't pay for the fuel, right? I mean, the sun is free, the wind is free. So, and that study doesn't even count the large-scale avoided damage that would occur if we take the high carbon path. So yes, we can afford it. And from the point of view of innovation, absolutely. I mean, the innovation that is going on right now is tremendous. The cost during the Obama years, the cost of wind energy fell by 66%. By solar energy fell by 85%. Wind capacity tripled. Solar capacity went up, started from a lower base, but went up by 23 times. Wind and solar now represent 2/3 of the new electricity that is built every year in the United States. 2/3. That's compared to fossil fuel. And go back to Tesla for a minute. Fascinating piece in the press just in the last week or so. The market value of Tesla is now larger than General Motors or Ford. Okay, General Motors sold 10 million cars last year. Ford sold 6.6 million cars last year. Tesla sold 76,000 cars last year. The market is betting on the future. They're betting on Tesla as the technology of the future. And this is the market. This isn't, us environmental types up here hoping. This is what the market's doing. And there's innovation going on a broad array of technologies, from material science and battery technology and so forth. Okay, that brings me to the fourth point, and the toughest nut to crack, and that's the politics. There was a famous sign in the 1992 Clinton campaign headquarters, where I spent just a few weeks, taped to the wall, that said, it's the economy, stupid. On climate change, I really think it's the politics, stupid. I mean, that is what is the most critical. And that's true all over the world, but ground zero for the political challenge is the United States. And I think we have fundamentally two political challenges. The first involves essentially climate skeptics or deniers. That's a battle that we're fundamentally winning from the point of view of public attitudes. If you look at polling, we are moving very strongly in the direction of belief in climate change and support for action. On a generational basis, that's even stronger. Something like 9 out of 10 millennials feel that way. But that's still not enough, because remember, you don't get action on the Hill unless and until you get to a point where politicians feel that opposing climate will be bad for them at the ballot box. So there's more work to do there. And of course, we also have a big problem that we have deniers and skeptics have taken over this administration. And that matters. I mean, the innovation changes that I was talking about, the developments in terms of clean energy, aren't going to go backwards. Coal is not suddenly going to rise from the dead because of Trump. But the pace of change won't be as strong because of the rollbacks of the very strong Obama-era policies that Trump is undertaking. So it's going to be, over the next few years, very important that we get as much action as we can from progressive states and cities, from progressive businesses, and we have important political work to do at the ballot box in 2018 and 2020. Okay, so there's a second political challenge, though, and that's what I would describe as the disconnect between what science and evidence is telling us on the one hand, and what even smart and informed people, the people who make up the policy community in Washington, the people who come to politics and prose, the disconnect between what science and evidence are telling us and what even those people assume is kind of good enough. And by that I mean there's an assumption of a sort of gradualism in terms of what we can do to deal with climate change that just is not right, does not match up with that 2-degree challenge I was talking about before. So political will is crucial, again, crucial all over the world, but crucial nowhere more than right here. So I'm sure I've talked way longer than I was supposed to, so I will stop here and pass this working microphone back.
Thanks. So yeah, again, I'm Dave Levitan. I'm going to look at my phone for notes because I didn't print anything out. But so it's good that Todd finished on politics because that's sort of what I've been focusing on. So yeah, my new book is about the ways politicians get science wrong in general. As you would imagine, climate change is sort of chief among them. I'd say it's more than half the book. I've read about the techniques and tricks and sort of rhetorical devices that we hear from politicians all the time. So I do have a couple of thoughts on sort of how that relates to what we're talking about here and what needs to happen, I guess. First of all, some historical context. I think it's important to remember that while the current political climate does seem dire, and in particular around scientific issues and climate in particular, I might argue that it's actually sort of a matter of degree rather than of kind, that this isn't unique. We have seen very similar techniques and methods used before. There have always been some anti-science attitudes in government, and there likely always will be as long as there are special interests or certain demographics, industries, so on, that will have some incentive to disguise the science in question. That's always been the case, and it always will be the case. So I do think it's kind of important to remember that it might feel dire, but that's kind of self-defeating in a way. We should remember that we've been here before, and there might be lessons to be learned. I mean, when it comes to climate, the playbook from politicians in terms of how they talk about it, and I'm talking about the ones who try and sort of disguise what's happening or get it wrong. A lot of what we hear from them, we actually heard almost identical types of comments in the 80s as it related to acid rain and sulfur dioxide. Things like, wait until all the info is in, or the science is not settled, or not everyone agrees with whatever study says. These are things which I'm sure people here are familiar with when it comes to climate. We hear them all the time, and that is almost identical to what we heard about with acid rain, and it was the same basic goal of delaying action, stopping us from putting policies into place that might actually help reduce sulfur dioxide emissions. And of course, we did eventually deal with that quite effectively with a cap and trade system. So the talking points are not new, and so there are lessons to be learned by looking to the past on how politicians have tried to mess with us on scientific issues before. Having said that, I will now counter my own point by saying that there is one aspect that does feel unique to me. The elected officials we're talking about now, in the case of climate, seem to have somehow come untethered from their special interest backers. This really does feel unique, that politicians are, at least to me, they seem sort of much farther removed from mainstream scientific consensus than the special interest groups that sort of started climate denial, or inspired, let's say, climate denial. They now, some politicians certainly have more of a climate denying attitude than Shell Oil does, or than Exxon does, which is remarkable when you think about it. So the techniques may be the same, but that sort of off the leash kind of extremism, that might actually be new, and it has surprised me. And so yes, there are lessons from the past, but also we should sort of remember to adjust to this sort of newer, bizarre reality when we're trying to require things of our elected officials, I guess. And finally, since this is a teach-in, I will offer a couple of quick thoughts on what to do about it, which I'm sure we can discuss more as we go. But the main one, and I hope this is satisfying because it sounds very broad and vague, but is that all of us should make an effort to read and listen more critically and skeptically, and we should remain skeptical of people in power on any side of the aisle. We should require evidence anytime you hear anything. I mean, that should be sort of in the back of your mind on scientific issues in particular, but really on anything. Evidence should be a basic requirement of a politician making a claim, and obviously the current moment makes that sound sort of ridiculous. But if we can make that, sort of part of our general vocabulary, what is the evidence for the thing you just said, then I think that would at least get people to get that more into the conversation and make it more of a sort of, a requirement that we all hold people to. So I will stop there.
Is this microphone? Yes. Good to be with you all, and thanks for having me. And it's really fun to be up on the stage, actually. I mean, I feel like I've probably sent Dave a press release, and I think I was in Copenhagen in 2009, but like doing a sit-in in the hallways when Todd was negotiating, and have probably tweeted incendiary things at him ever since. So it's really fun to be here together. So again, my name is Jamie Henn. I'm one of the co-founders of 350.org. And we are a international climate change campaign that is really focused on trying to address this political crisis that we're speaking of, and trying to mobilize the public, not just here in this country, but all around the world, to really rise to the challenge of climate change and build that clean energy economy that works for everyone that Todd was talking about. So I want to get into how do we actually begin to do that. This is a incredibly exciting week to be in Washington, D.C. to talk about this. How many people were out at the March for Science yesterday? It was extraordinary in the rain and all here in D.C. across the country. It was a tremendous showing. And as someone that has helped do big mobilizations in the past and has been there when you're working on logistics and how does these things pull off, a huge kudos and thanks to everybody that came out, to people that volunteered, to the organizing of it. These things aren't easy to pull off. And to see it go so well yesterday, and I think send such a clear message, is a real testament to all the organizers and people that worked on that. The fun does not stop. This week, there are a lot of great events that are happening in DC. I did bring a few flyers. I left in my bag, but I'll try and hand out. If you go to peoplesclimate.org, that website has a whole list of events that range from more teach-ins, trainings on how you can run for office if you're interested, a launch of a new clean energy bill from Jeff Merkley and Bernie Sanders, which will be coming out on Tuesday, an event there on the Hill, other actions that you can take part of, and then, of course, the next big event, which will be this People's Climate March on Saturday. Let me get the logistics of that out of the way before I dive into more of the organizing. If you are coming out, the best time to come out is around, the march will start lining up at 11 down there on the mall by the Capitol, near the Capitol Reflecting Pool, probably around Jefferson, and then things kick off at 12:30, and we're going to march over to the White House and attempt, and I think we're going to have enough people to completely surround the property from all the way to Pennsylvania down to Constitution. And thanks to the Science March, one of those satellites that they had actually arranged to take photos is hopefully going to try and catch a photo of this happening, which would be very cool. So please do come out, and throughout the week, we are having people volunteer. There are people right now doing phone banks, text banks, visibility every day at metro stops. So there's links up on that peoplesclimate.org website about how to get involved, and this really is the final push. So any hours that you have this week to call people, or any hours that you're just sitting at home and can call through your phone book yourself and tell people to come out, is good organizing to be done. So, of course, big mobilizations like this are important. This is one of the ways that we try and both push back against what this administration is doing, show public opposition, make sure that we're the ones in the media who are defining this narrative, that we're not allowing this administration to get away with the lies and misinformation that it's telling, but also to try and put forward new narratives and new political movements that can begin to address this crisis that we're facing in this country right now. I think, as Todd said, one of the best examples of that where we can double down is around the promise of this new clean energy economy. We don't only have facts and science on our side, we actually have the jobs numbers on our side. There are more people getting jobs and being employed in wind and solar and renewables and all the traditional trades, from electricians to teachers, who are going to be part of this new economy than are getting employed in the fossil fuel industry right now. And we need to focus on providing a transition for those who are in that industry, but also be strong and adamant about talking about the potential of going in a new direction. The thing that keeps me motivated is thinking about November 9th, 2020, when we're all going to be here again, throwing a big party, because we just elected a fantastic woman president who came into office with a clean energy agenda, who's pledging to get America to 100% clean energy, that sees this as the next moonshot, that is inspiring young people all across this country to get involved. That is within reach if we actually start organizing now. If we work backwards from that, that can begin in places like here in DC and all across the country, where we put forward that vision, where we get our neighbors and people and businesses and everybody else engaged and feeling like that 100% clean energy economy is possible. That movement, if we do our job for the next 2 years, can help to change the narrative of this country so that every person that's running for governor in 2018 and people running for national office are running on platforms like that. That helps move the agenda in our direction. 2018, 2019, primaries begin, and 2020, there we are. It's easy, right? It's easy. So, we can do it. You can applaud for that. That's what we can do it. So, on the TeachIn front, how do we get to work on that? A couple things just from my years of organizing and activism and all the mistakes that we've made at 350 and in other groups over the years. A couple things to keep in mind if you're doing local organizing that I think are sort of things that I try and focus on. One is really telling a good story. Thinking about communications. I'm our communications director, so it's my area. But I think that people undervalue the importance of really doing the writing, being out there on social media, getting into the local newspaper, writing things in blogs, telling stories, beginning to really think of campaigning and the change you're trying to create as if it was the article that you were going to read about it. You know, when the movie is made of your local campaign, what does that look like? Who are the characters? What were the moments of drama? actually plan that out. Sort of think of yourself as like a producer or a script writer, and really try and plan a campaign that has that sense of narrative momentum, because that will make it more interesting for those who are engaged and will ultimately help drive that forward. The second piece that I would say as a piece of advice is be action-oriented. Often as campaigners, we get really bogged down. And like if we're trying to pass the fossil fuel divestment bill here in DC, we get lost in the intricacies of, are we, moving this politician or that one, or are we getting involved in data? And forget that sometimes by consistently doing actions, by finding new creative things to do, we can push work forward. And actually groups here in DC have done a really good job on that. But being engaged in the community, doing things like this, teach-ins, having a bike ride for something, doing a play, going to a church and doing a sermon, whatever it is, that multiple types of engaging in the community over and over is what actually keeps the movement going. So be action-oriented. And then third is building alliances, is finding ways to come together with different partners and thinking broadly about that. This bookstore is a perfect example of the type of partner that one might not normally think of when you're doing a campaign, but of course, what a valuable asset to have in the community, what an important role it can play. So really do look out for new allies, find ways that they can come together. When you have a common goal, like climate, just about everybody can contribute, whether it's the coffee shop across the street or the auto dealership that's gonna talk about how excited they are to work on your Tesla one day. So there are ways for people to engage, so think creatively about where you can find alliances, because those unexpected allies are actually much more interesting than the traditional environmentalists all getting together. And that is one of the reasons why I think this coming Saturday will be so important. The People's Climate March has represented a real effort by multiple movements to articulate a common agenda, to cross different divides that have kept our movements apart for different areas. There are over 900 organizations that are endorsed and are part of the march. That includes the NAACP, to indigenous organizations, to major international labor unions like SEIU, who's been one of the main sponsors here in DC, to environmental groups, to youth groups, to you name it. Seeing that sort of diversity of groups come together to talk about how race and equity, how social justice and LGBT rights and everything else connect with climate is so inspiring and important to be done. And I think it's a way that we actually build strength together and see our fights as really being connected, so that that November 9th moment a few years from now can become a reality. So thank you all so much, and please do. We'll see you on next Saturday in the streets.
Thank you. So now you've heard from this incredible panel, and we're going to have a little bit of a conversation up here for a few minutes, and then after about 15 minutes, start taking some audience questions. So I'm sure that many of you are sitting on some really great, really meaty questions to throw toward the panel or toward people on the panel. So start thinking of those if you want to come up and ask a question in a little bit. So, but I wanted to start us off with a question that kind of goes to everybody and touches on one of the issues that keeps coming up, which is the scope of climate change just as an issue. Climate change has these wide-ranging impacts at multiple levels, and it's hard to coherently communicate that sometimes, or often, I guess, in a way that makes it feel really, truly urgent. And I just wanted to very generally start off that train of thought by asking, maybe starting with Jamie for this one, what is one aspect of the current climate change crisis that you feel is probably under-discussed, and maybe tapping into it could generate more momentum or conversation, maybe help, increase that urgency?
Interesting. It's a really good question. I think a lot of things when we talk about the mainstream media are under-discussed. So I think that doing a better job of continuing to highlight the direct impacts that climate change is already having on people's lives is important. We get lost in sort of the big dramatic impacts sometimes far away, but don't actually track the things that really annoy people, like the pollen, being worse each season, mosquitoes spreading disease. So there are ways that I think we can do that. But something that's really off the radar even more, I would say actually, I think we do need to have more of a discussion, both as advocates and in the press, around how we actually adapt to the impacts that are already happening. And I don't say that to mean that we need to give up on mitigation, as we say, in terms of really going after reducing carbon. But I think we do need to really recognize that people around the world, especially in vulnerable communities in this country, already are feeling the impacts of climate change and pollution as well. And it actually, by separating mitigation and adaptation, or how we really reduce emissions and how we deal with the impacts, we lose a potential place where they actually come together. That building resilient communities goes hand in hand with having a transition to renewable energy often. That localizing our food system is a good idea because of the threat of climate change, but also a good idea because it reduces the carbon emissions associated with it. So I think that understanding the intersections between these things and taking a bit more of a holistic view about what the solutions really are can help us get into a more local discussion of what our communities are really going to look like. And ultimately, hopefully help address that communications piece where people don't just see climate change as some distant threat that, they're worried about, but they don't think will impact their lives. I think what recent polling showed was, 70% of America, I'm slightly making up the numbers, but something around 70% of Americans felt like climate change was a serious concern, but very few, downwards of 40%, thought it would impact their own lives. That's a problem because it shows that there's basic kind of support for the issue, but it's not a core issue that really motivates people. So I think the more we can translate that into more of a holistic view of this is what it means for your life, both the solutions and the impacts, hopefully the greater people will be engaged.
I have two answers to that. One is very similar to what you were saying. I think from a sort of media perspective, if you think of more local level media, I think it is really important for people to do, as you said, to find the specific impacts of specific communities, because there are climate related impacts that you can find literally everywhere. And if they haven't happened yet, they're coming very soon. So things like pollen or in farming communities, there will be a whole host of stories that people in the media should be doing. And some of them are, for sure. But so the local angle is definitely like find the stories that impact people right now. And I do think it is undercovered in a sense that you don't hear a ton of those stories. From a broader sort of national or international media perspective, I think displacement of people and refugees is the undercovered story. And especially given how much attention the word refugee has been getting recently, I think there is such an opportunity to tell just incredibly, very scary stories about the amount of people who are going to be displaced by climate change or already are being displaced. And that really might have an impact if those stories are done well and consistently, because I do think it's not a discussion that has been sort of really had just yet.
I think I agree with both of people here, by the way. Is this working? Yeah, okay. I agree with comments of both of my co-panelists. Maybe I'd turn this question around just a little bit to the two kinds of political problems that I was talking about before. So the first one, as you recall, involves those who are in the kind of skeptics camp. Often, I think, on the basis of almost self-evidently on the basis of little actual knowledge. But if you think of the very substantial number of people who supported President Trump in the election, you've got a lot of those people who are pretty much. By no means all of them, but a lot of them in the kind of skeptical camp. And I think one of the things that's most important, that's going to be most important with respect to reaching people like that is the messenger as much as the message. I mean, people, and there's actually been a lot of writing about this lately, but the notion that people tend to have much more open minds and much more willing to listen if they think that they are talking to somebody from their own tribe, or if somebody from their own tribe is talking to them. And there are plenty of those people. There's any number of people, large numbers of people from the business community. I'm sure that the same can be said from the farming community and other places. So I think that an effort to try to make progress by not just repeating the same old stories of danger and risk that they hear from media sources that they don't trust, or from people that feel alien to them, I think is going to be limited in its impact. mean, the other political challenge I talked about is reaching people who are quite tuned into policy, even quite tuned into the notion that climate change is dangerous, but would have looked, for example, at Paris and the president's Clean Power Plan and sort of said, okay, we got this. And those are big, important steps, but we way don't got this, even with those things. So I guess I don't have an easy answer about how that kind of communication needs to happen, but I think that it really does. I think that it is important for a community outside of the actual climate and environmental community that gets this stuff. It's going to be really important to get the message of what's the pace of change that we need. Like living in a realistic world. I mean, you can't, go up and try to persuade people to do things that are, or companies to do things that are undoable, but it is important for people to get just what the seriousness of the issue is, and people who are, like I said, in that sort of second tier.
It seems to me, I want to follow up on a couple of things related to sort of scope and scale that just came up in your responses. But it seems to me that part of the issue is often that we're talking about a global long-term issue, and often working within more short-term frameworks, and operating as nations. How do we tackle climate change given those sort of limitations? And I think especially so. On the one hand, we don't talk enough about refugees. We don't talk about the potential and reality of the fact that climate change is creating refugees and involved in refugee crises, which is an international issue. And then on the other hand, trying to make it feel local and tangible in communities. So how do we bridge that gap? How do we think more effectively about how to communicate, given that this is happening on multiple scales? How do we negotiate that? Yeah.
I don't think I have an easy answer for that. I guess I would say that I think you've got to be operating on all of the different levels at the same time. I mean, I think that to the extent that people along coasts start to see that their insurance rates are going up, or that they can't even get insurance. There's, by the way, the New York Times Magazine today is I commend to all of you that the whole issue is focused on climate change, and there's a lot of very interesting stuff there. But and I thought of it because there's a big piece on sea level rise, so I think that to the extent people see impacts in their own communities and in their own lives, and that's critical, and to the extent that you can have people, the further you get from Washington and the closer you get to the ground, the less you have people operating on an ideological and polemical level. Mayors have to deal with actual day-to-day problems and day-to-day issues, and governors a little less than mayors, but still. And so I think that the degree to which people see something in their own lives, you can't, there's no substitution for that. But you also necessarily have to be working at a global level, and have to be working at a global level the way we did with respect to negotiating an agreement. But that's just a start, right? I mean, the agreement lays out a framework. They will need to, to go back to what I was saying when I was telling you about Paris. Every 5 years, countries are supposed to re-up. Well, that's not going to happen just by itself. It's not going to happen well enough just by itself. It's going to happen because you're operating at that global level as well as at the local level. But I'll stop here.
So yeah, I thought of one thing. There is, in a way, an opportunity to sort of bridge those scale issues that you're talking about from some of the stuff that I read about politicians messing this up. So I'm going to give a quick example. Lamar Smith, a Republican from Texas, yes, close to all our hearts.
subpoenaing my organization right now, but another story.
No, not shocking. He liked to talk about the Clean Power Plan, Obama's climate-related policy, and how, if enacted in full, it would only stop sea level rise by, I forget the number, 0.02 millimeters or something. He repeated this quite a bit. His point was that this has almost no effect when you're thinking globally. This and we shouldn't do it, therefore, because there's an economic impact on the U.S., which he was wrong about also, but beside the point. The opportunity there is to throw that back at him, like, okay, fine, even if we say that you're right about the 0.02 millimeters, the leadership that the U.S. shows with that plan leads to the Paris Agreement, or at least contributes to the Paris Agreement. And if all of the countries' Paris Agreement plans are enacted, here's how many feet of sea level rise we might be able to avoid. So connecting these types of stories to each other, going from Lamar Smith's millimeters to the Paris Agreement, and then coming back. Is this not working anymore? Coming back. Nope. It's working? Okay. And then coming back from that to the idea that we are actually going to prevent far more than those few millimeters of sea level rise. So that's just one example of the opportunities that are presented by some of these things.
So the other side of this, I live in Wyoming, for context. So as you can imagine, the conversations that we have about climate, or lack thereof, I guess, climate change, that is, in Wyoming are a little bit different because it's an energy state. And so often you hear the other side to this, which is doing anything is going to cause us to lose jobs. It's going to affect, these particular communities that have arisen around various industries. It might make us less competitive as a nation in the short term. Do you have any sympathy for that argument in general, and how do you sort of go with the conversation from there?
Oh, maybe a couple of points. First of all, you will inevitably. If go back to what I was saying earlier about the degree to which we won't be able to use fossil fuels if we're going to meet the targets that we're talking about. There will inevitably be impacts on communities, and I think that one makes a mistake by trying to pretend that that's not so. And I think what is really important is that political leadership invest a lot of energy and a lot of resources to try to bring alternatives to those communities. I read an article recently that there's I forget if it's solar or either solar or wind. Facility that is being planned in some big coal state, might be West Virginia, so you can't gloss over that. These are real problems. But on the other hand, you can't say, well, because that's true, we're not going to go forward here, because we have to go forward, and we have to go forward for the sake of the people who live in those communities as well as anywhere else. But you can't. But you've got to really take it on as a problem and deal with it. The other thing is, in terms of broader U.S. competitiveness, there is nothing that will make us stronger than full speed ahead on the clean energy transformation. No country on earth has got the comparative advantage that the United States has with respect to innovation, with respect to having an innovation culture and innovation infrastructure the way we do. So the only thing that's going to hold us back is policies that are counterproductive to that effort and that development. And as I think Jamie said earlier, the number of jobs, if I'm not mistaken, the number of jobs just from solar are already more than the extractive jobs from coal, gas, and oil put together. There's just no question where this is going. But you've got to deal with West Virginia, you've got to deal with Wyoming, you've got to deal with places where communities are going to be hurt.
I would just add one thing on that, which is I think, the most dramatic best examples are going to be where you can literally replace, the coal mining job with a retrain at the solar facility. But that isn't always the way it's going to go. There are ways where people they don't want they're older, they're not going to be retrained. And I think there are ways that we need to think about how to broaden that discussion, that actually talking about compensation for miners, a package that the Republican Congress hasn't actually passed through. We should be good advocates on that as well. Environmentalists need to get involved in fights that isn't just about training people to be solar installers, but saying you deserve quality health care, you deserve a compensation, you deserve a hospital in West Virginia that may create more jobs than the solar factory that maybe should be better placed someplace else. So I think that actually by becoming advocates that take a broader look at the way that the economy is structured right now and put forward a bit of a broader agenda, we can help make some progress there in those places. And then finally, just that fact alone, that there are more people now involved in the solar industry than coal, oil, and gas, the fact that we are so badly losing the debate on jobs is just unacceptable at this point. And I think that that's a key challenge for all of us, whether it's at a local level of convincing our, skeptical family member or whatever it is, but also our politicians need to get much more fluent in talking about this issue, going out and campaigning at places where solar installers are doing the work, touring buildings that have been retrofitted and creating jobs, going out to wind turbine places, dragging CNN with them to talk about how a community has been revitalized. That's the work that needs to start happening in this country so that we can shift that narrative away, and Trump can't get away with standing inside the EPA with coal workers and acting as if he has a jobs agenda.
So just a quick note here. So I have one more question that I'm going to throw to the panel. But if you have questions that you would like to ask during the question and answer session, now would be a great time to start lining up behind the microphone. So please feel free to do that, and I will ask my last question and then open it up. So my last question, I just wanted us to get a little bit specific about what's happening right now. So I think a lot of people at the moment are concerned and anxious, obviously, about the fact that, we may be in a political position where we're picking up an agenda related to denialism, but maybe a little bit unclear in general about what in particular is under threat right now. So I was wondering if you could touch on what's at stake, what might happen. And yeah, I know this could go on for quite a while, but if you could just summarize for the audience maybe some of the particular things they should keep their eye on.
I'll pick a couple out of the hat, but I don't want to take them all up for you guys. I think one thing to look at this week, the Trump administration has said that on Friday it's going to come out with new executive orders again on climate. The two that I think were put out just an hour or so ago that were leaked to the press was one on offshore drilling. That will be a real expansion. This week is the 7-year anniversary of the BP oil spill. This administration is going back in full force in that direction. So organizing in coastal communities, bringing governors back together who spoke out against offshore drilling and holding that back will be key. Second one is one that is a little bit wonky but is incredibly important, which is reviewing the Antiquities Act. The Antiquities Act is what allows a president to declare national monuments. The Obama administration, one evolution that did take place was the administration really moving from all of the above when they came in, and Obama going to stand in pipeline yards and talk about how much energy was being produced to really evolving, and to their credit, moving to more of a keep it in the ground approach and using the Antiquities Act to declare national monuments from most notably perhaps right now Bears Ears in Utah. Right wing, this administration is going after that. If we are going to do what Todd is saying in terms of being able to actually show some restraint and take fossil fuels, the majority of which are on public lands, and use our ability to keep those underground, if this administration can dismantle things like the Antiquities Act, that will make it much harder in the future for people to come back and have the legal tools we need to actually move forward. So some of these kind of legal provisions, it's not just the damage that they do now, but the lasting implications that really undoing some of these laws will be done. The good news is that there's a lot of lawyers on our side, too, who are fighting hard, and credit to the Obama administration to really using the law in an effective way. So the lawyers will fight back, but I think all the rest of us need to do our job and make these things an issue as well.
So real quick, the main thing that I would say to look out for is budget. The budget that the Trump administration has put out would just do awful things to the scientific endeavors across the government. In terms of climate, this would mean, the obvious one is the EPA would face I think it was 31% cut. This was a preliminary budget, so obviously this might change, but this was what we've had so far. The EPA would have a huge cut. NASA's Earth science missions, which are a primary reason we know what we do know about the changing climate, those would be eliminated. I think 4 entire missions would be eliminated. Let's see. ARPA-E, the Advanced Research Project Agency Energy, which is a hugely important source of energy-related innovation, and a lot of the reason that we've seen some of those drops in the costs of solar and wind, that would be eliminated entirely. So those sorts of things are, I mean, this is going to be a fight that's happening like pretty much right now over the next few weeks and couple of months. So if that's something, I mean, that's something that I would keep my eye on. Yeah.
I agree with both of those comments, and I think Dave's comment about the budget fights is a very important one, because these are places where there's a lot of danger, but where there is still some hope of being able to push back against it. There are other big things that the administration is working on that would roll back the most consequential positive actions of the Obama administration. It's going to be hard, I think, to stop that, but that includes unwinding the Clean Power Plan, which regulates the whole power sector, and they have also indicated that they plan to try to move backwards with respect to the miles per gallon standards, the vehicle standards. Think about the fact that power is about a third of our emissions and transportation is about a third of our emissions. Those are big actions, and also they are intending to cut back on the regulation of methane, which is the second biggest greenhouse gas. CO2 is the biggest one, but methane is probably 20% of our greenhouse gases. So in a pretty across the board way, they are looking to roll back. But I do like a focus on the budgetary fights, because there, unlike some of these other places, there's still some chance to lessen the damage.
Great. So we're going to open it up for questions.
Okay, great. Well, I want to give my thanks to the panel and the whole program here, and to Politics and Prose for doing this. But my specific question has to do with the ideas of mitigation vis-a-vis adaptation. So I was really pleased to hear you say that you thought that you embraced both, and that both are necessary, even thinking that perhaps they reinforce each other. But I was a little bit surprised, though, at that, because I have the sense, and I'm not sure that I'm right in this, but that there's a certain argument being made that focus now on adaptation will kind of weaken the resolve for mitigation, and that it may delay, at least, the efforts towards mitigation. So the question is, do you believe that? I guess another part of the question is, do all three of you agree on sort of the equal emphasis on adaptation and versus mitigation? How does the energy industry look at this? It seems like when it comes to adaptation, government would largely be paying, so we'd pay through taxes, but that when it comes to mitigation, we'll pay for it at the gas pump and other bills directly. So does the industry, I don't know the answer to this either, kind of favor looking to adaptation rather than mitigation? The energy industry, that is. So, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll quickly respond. I think that it could, but it doesn't necessarily distract from mitigation. I think if anything, it may strengthen the case. I mean, I think that I live in Boston these days, and when the city started getting serious about putting out its adaptation plan, suddenly it got even more serious about mitigation, because it looked at the potential of sea level rise in the city and said, oh my God, I mean, the cost of building seawalls and these things is so high that, to Todd's point, we need to actually move much more quickly in the mitigation approach. So I think that can be the result if done well. But you're right. I mean, I think as 350, we focus much more on the mitigation category, stopping fossil fuel projects, promoting renewable energy. But I think there is a way to perhaps combine the two a little bit, and I think ultimately there's a moral responsibility to do so, especially in this country where we are, and especially those of us, of privilege here, to be able to be a bit farther removed perhaps from some of the worst impacts, that I think there is a responsibility as a community to really help those who are being impacted along the way. The one thing I'd also just throw out as a cautionary note is that the geoengineering debate is really moving forward. and getting started in ways that I think are really dangerous. And so getting out ahead of that and not sort of letting us suddenly assume that we can throw iron filings into the ocean and spray chemicals in the atmosphere and that's going to solve the problem is really important. Because if you think that debate's happening now, just wait 5 to 10 years from now. So I think really thinking clearly about how do we avoid getting into this sort of scenario is important.
I think that you absolutely just have to do both things at the same time, and I think that it's some, at least in the level of the international negotiations, it's some time ago. I would say even back in the 90s, there was some sense of don't talk about adaptation because that would suggest that we're giving up on mitigation. I don't think people think of it that way now. The Obama administration, in terms of the United States, actually had a lot of focus on adaptation. I think it's the third assessment, if I have the number right, that they did about 2 years ago on adaptation is actually an extremely good, detailed, readable document, sort of sector by sector and region by region within the country. And then internationally, I always kind of have my international hat on, there's probably 100 or more countries that are overwhelmingly focused on adaptation because they don't create much in the way of emissions. They're really poor. Their level, if you add them all up together, they're, I'm sure, less than 1% of global emissions, but they face huge dangers. So the focus on adaptation in the international negotiations has just gone way, way up. And but that can't be at the exclusion of mitigation either, because anybody who thinks that, well, let's just focus on adaptation now and not mitigation is crazy, because it's just going to get that much worse if we don't tame the beast. So you got to do both.
Right.
Great question. Thank you.
Thank you for the panel. I was encouraged by the moderator's comments about concerns for those who have lost jobs that were in the fossil fuel industry. And I just wonder how much awareness there is in the climate change community of how related climate change deniers are to people who feel left behind, and that these further changes will leave them yet further behind. And I understand there's some focus on that, but it seems that if you truly want to change attitudes of climate change deniers to supporters, you have to allow them a situation where they can be more objective, where they're not losing jobs. There's more focus on replacement jobs, and so that they can support their families and not be worried about that. And to say, for instance, well, we'll give the former miners benefits. People want to work; they just don't want benefits. And in these areas, and I have relatives from West Virginia, it's not just the people with mining jobs who are affected, but the whole community that are effective, and the major opioid problems at this point. But I just would just urge, to the extent it's not there, that the climate change community had more of a awareness of linking these two issues, of these people who have felt left behind economically and who feel threatened with further economic loss, and how it's not just jobs anywhere that's important. They need jobs geographically where people have lost jobs.
I couldn't agree with you more. I was sort of trying to make that point a little bit earlier, I was in the Obama administration, obviously, and I was in the Clinton administration once upon a time. I was not in the Clinton campaign, but a number of my colleagues were, and I tried to urge the same point, that I would over budget what you think you might need to do, because the reality is, if you add all of that, there's 65,000 miners in this country. That's a small number, relatively speaking, and I understand it also radiates around the communities that they're from. But if you process the enormity of the challenge that we're facing and the billions and trillions of dollars that need to be spent, to be able to develop the political support by making people in those communities less antagonistic and maybe even friendly would do a world of good. So I'm all for that.
Thank you. Next question.
In terms of telling stories, my background is that I was a Air Force physician, and I see the two biggest threats from climate change is national security and health. And health is a pretty easy, broad category to tell stories from in terms of people getting sick. I mean, Zika's all over the news. Climate change is helping it move everywhere. Air pollution is a good story. Most people know somebody with asthma or a respiratory problem. Climate change is going to make all that worse. So I would urge those stories to come out. And relative to national security, we don't hear climate change and national security talked about very much, and I think it's a tremendous missed opportunity. It's directly connected to what you brought up about the displaced persons, the refugee crisis, i.e. maybe Syria. So I just wonder what your thoughts are of bringing up both those topics in terms of our storytelling. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think you're absolutely right that those are both great sources of stories. In terms of the sheer sort of number of them, I think you're right that health is the bigger opportunity. I will sort of throw a little cold water on it in the sense that people have been writing sort of environmental justice stories for quite a while, not necessarily about climate change, but just about what people living near the coal plant have had happen to them. And while they're certainly good stories and sometimes have made a difference, the money behind that industry has made it very hard for that to actually make a dent. So that's a very pessimistic comment, but it is something I think we've seen and have to sort of deal with. In terms of national security, that's one I've written about that a few times, and I think that's a great one because the U.S. military has for quite a while been absolutely rational about climate change and have called it a threat multiplier for some time now. And even during the Bush administration, they were already making sort of rational, reasonable assessments of what climate change was going to do to national security because they didn't have any elections to win. So it didn't matter to them, really. So I agree that the coverage of that should probably expand. But people have addressed it. I mean, the phrase threat multiplier related to climate change has certainly been out there in a lot of stories over the years. But we could certainly do better in the media of covering those things, yes.
I just add, there's a great new film that I think is being screened in D.C. this week called The Age of Consequences, which is all about security and climate. And so if you go, I'm sure there's a screening this week, in fact. So that's a great film to watch and to share on that issue. And again, I just say, one of the largest sponsors of the Climate March on Saturday is the Service Employees International Union, which is the largest healthcare union in the country. They're sponsoring it both because they think climate is important, but also because as healthcare workers, they see the effects of this firsthand, and not just climate change, but the fossil fuel-related air pollution issues that are coming in, and their members are affected by that directly as well, not just through their job, but through where they live. So I think that the health community is really mobilized, but of course, there's much more that could be done in that area.
Yeah, I would just say that when I speak, when I'm speaking for a longer period of time and can go on at greater length, I sometimes read a quote about the really dire threat to national security that we're facing, and then I tell people that so this quote did not come from Greenpeace or it didn't come from 350.org, it came from the Pentagon. It came from the 2014 Quadrennial Review, and so I actually don't understand why this has not been, why we haven't succeeded in making this a bigger issue, but I think it's important.
Thank you. Next question.
Sure, just kind of a couple little ones. If we really do get down the road some decades and we haven't done a very good job of cutting back carbon, what are the prospects for either geoengineering or carbon capture? Are there really prospects for those being good things to do? And the other one, I just wanted to ask about the refugees. Can you give us some examples of where that's already occurred?
Let me make one quick comment. I know Jamie has some things to say about geoengineering, but I think that first of all, carbon capture and storage is not something to wait, decades down the pike for. I think if there's one area where you might potentially see some actual, muscle put behind the research during the Trump years, maybe it would be that, because that would be seen as a coal-friendly thing to do. It would be enormously useful to have some more progress made there, whether it's used for coal or natural gas or whatever. I don't think it's my own sense is it's not the thing that's the salvation, but progress would be a good thing, and whether it's in the United States or it's in India or China or other places, I think that would be good. Geoengineering is fraught, and I think that the posture of the Obama administration was research should go on, but there weren't going to be any direct sort of support from the point of view of that being the direction we should go, but that research should go on because you never know. But you might have a different.
Well, I mean, I think there are certain types of things that we could be doing in the geoengineering category that are quite helpful. Soil sequestration, for instance, looking at the agricultural system and thinking what are ways that we potentially could be creating better carbon sinks with soil and pieces are interesting, and I think it's potentially valuable. I think the dangerous ones are in the kind of sci-fi apocalyptic category. Some of the proposals put up about spraying chemicals into the atmosphere that would create a reflective shield that would bounce sunlight back into space. That starts tinkering. I mean, sunlight is what we use to grow things like food. This is a strange system to start tinkering with. I mean, in a way, we've already been geoengineering the planet with carbon dioxide and the industry for a while, and we're seeing how well that's turned out. I think the other piece to think about is that you don't just spray the chemicals up and then it works and then you go home. You have to constantly maintain that. So the second that someone decides, we don't have the funding this year to do that, your reflective shield goes away and you get the impact of all of that warming right off the bat again, really quickly and consequentially. So these things become really complicated when you look into it. The other final piece is, who do we trust to do it? Todd had to negotiate a climate agreement. I can only imagine the geoengineering agreement where, we say, okay, China, you do it this year, and then Putin, you spray the chemicals next year. I mean, to actually agree about that at a planetary scale, once you start thinking about how expensive, how complicated it is, it's like, wouldn't it just be easier to put up some solar panels and drive a few Teslas? I mean, that's a much easier, cheaper, better way to solve this problem than going down that road. So certain types of research, of course. I mean, we should be researching it. We should look into it. We should understand the threats. We should look for opportunities. But I think thinking that that's going to save us down the road is foolhardy and dangerous.
Real quick on that, I think one of the scariest things about solar radiation management type of geoengineering is that it's not expensive. It would only be a few $1 billion a year for some random country or rich person who decided to do this, and they could. And so that's what really scares me about it. In terms of refugees, now that I scared everybody, just a few quick examples of places that this is already happening. There are a few examples even in the U.S. of people who have been basically deemed climate refugees. There was a town in Alaska whose name is escaping me at the moment. Another town in Louisiana, I think, based on wetland loss that was deemed climate related. Around the world, you have a few island nations that are already sort of in a lot of trouble. There was an entire town in the Solomon Islands that moved. There is the country of Kiribati, which is a whole series of islands, bought land in Fiji, 2,000 miles away, just in case they all have to leave. So there's been a whole bunch of these examples, and that's before we even get to a place like Bangladesh, where tens of millions of people probably will eventually have to leave their homes. So, sorry.
I'd like to add to that bombshell and bring up the fact that despite all of the technological advancement and all of the political success we've had in the past few years, the amount of CO2 output per person continues to increase every single year. I think we are failing in what we're trying to do here. The politics, the technological advancements, it's not working. And because of that, I want to ask and actually want to demand that we do more than yell at our politicians and buy Teslas and recycle and all the other, frankly, meaningless things that we think we're doing to help. If each one of those 70% of the people in the country actually believed in this problem, if they actually lived like they did, and that means refusing to eat food that results in the rainforest being cut down at 1 acre per second. That means eating less or eating no meat whatsoever, reducing animal product consumption, even having less kids. I'm sorry, this offends people, but we are in much worse trouble than most people realize. And yeah, political action is has a great potential to help, but I wish we would make as much of an effort in talking to each other about what we can do to stop supporting the companies that do this, to reduce our own consumption. The only reason all of this is going on is because of the demands that we're making on the world, us, the little people. The only reason the big businesses are doing these things is because we're telling them to. And I really wish we would stop that. Thank you.
Jamie, how do you talk about this question of sort of sacrifice and trade-offs in the context of activism?
Well, I think it's correct. I mean, it's a good point. I mean, we all can do more, for sure. And I think that all the things you listed are important things to consider. I think it is, I slightly disagree on that it's because of our demands on these companies. I think actually quite the opposite often, that consumers have demanded different products, but the companies have spent millions of dollars to perpetuate a certain system. If you look at the role of ExxonMobil and others in perpetuating climate denial and spreading misinformation, I think they bear a responsibility. When you ask people if they want more public transit, if they want electric vehicles, they often will say yes, but those things don't happen because of powerful lobbies from different industries. So I think that there is a role in that to really tackle. I think the thing for me is, we at 350, when we started, it was right after An Inconvenient Truth, and at the end of the movie said, change your light bulbs, and we said, don't change your light bulbs, change your politicians, So we were sort of anti-individual action because it felt like it was often an excuse, but people thought that was enough and wouldn't get engaged politically. I think I've come around to a feeling of individual action is good to do. The best kind is one that affirms your political action as well. I think that if you can take individual action that helps kind of deepen your commitment and understanding to also doing the political work, also doing the organizing, I think that's really powerful. And that's why, people of faith, you have rituals that you do because it deepens your commitment to the issue. So I think it's sort of resituating individual action within that political context that I think is important. And finally, I would just say, I think many of the changes make our lives much better, much healthier. I rode, the metro up here. It was great. I had a really nice walk through your lovely neighborhood here over to the bookstore. These things this makes our lives better, enriches our lives, enriches our experience, and can really improve our quality of life in different places. So there are sacrifices to be made, and we should make those, and we should make those in an honest way. But it's not all doom and gloom in that regard.
Hey, Kristen, we have time for 4 more questions. So
Great.
2 over here and 2 over there.
Great, thank you. So I think we have a question over here.
Hi, thank you. So as a kid, I grew up in Saudi Arabia where my father worked for the National Saudi Oil Company. So I'm always curious as to what pressures are being brought to bear on the oil-producing countries of the world, OPEC, in regards to climate change.
Yep, I think it's you.
Sounds like me. This was a multi-year effort to move toward what ultimately became the Paris Agreement, and Saudi Arabia is an interesting example of how there was evolution in its own kind of diplomacy and international politics. The Saudis for years, I got tossed into this issue when I was working on other things completely in the Clinton White House, and I got drafted to work on climate change about 5 months before the Kyoto meeting in 1997. So that was kind of my introduction. And back then, and for quite a number of years after that, the Saudis were represented by a diplomat who was kind of famously and joyously obstructionist. I mean, he was quite successful. He was quite skilled at what he did. he actually worked quite closely back then with some of the fossil fuel interests from the U.S. even. Fast forward, and he was still in the chair when I came into the job for Obama in 2009. But fast forward a year or two, I think even by 2010 or so, a new person had been brought in, much more moderate in tone. Obviously, the Saudis and some of the other countries in the Gulf, their bread and butter is fossil fuel, so they're not going to suddenly take the same position that Kiribati or Tuvalu are going to take in terms of full-out action. But they cared enough about not looking like they were going to be the obstructor, not looking like they were going to try to pull the whole thing down. And we worked, not only the United States, but the United States was an important player here. We worked with them a lot to try to identify how this thing could get structured in a way that they could live with, where they would be making progress in their own right, but also allowing the whole thing to go forward. One of the facts that this question just brings to mind, which people might not know, is that to underscore the extreme difficulty of this dive of getting, off the 10-meter board of getting this agreement done. You have 190 plus countries, and it's a consensus rule, essentially a consensus rule of engagement in the negotiations. So, any one or two or three countries out of that whole group can stop it. So if the Saudis actually said flat out no, it wouldn't have happened. So you needed to work through all of those different issues. But the Saudis, and I spent some time there and spent. I mean, I went there, but I also spent a huge amount of time negotiating with them, and also UAE and Qatar and others in the Gulf. So they don't have an easy. I mean, you can sort of sympathize with their, with what they're facing, but they definitely moved over time, and that was useful.
Thank you. Next question.
I wanted to ask somewhat about the intersection of education and politics. I've been very distressed in the last campaign about the mistrust of educated people, of experts, and of elites. I noticed today that Marie Le Pen said that her victory, such as it was in the French elections, was a victory over elites. And I wondered how we can both influence the people who in turn influence politicians and influence the politicians themselves in this atmosphere. And who can people believe? I know Bill Nye is, I think, a pretty good spokesperson for these causes. But, and I noticed yesterday at the march you had Philadelphia school teachers. I think science teachers are sometimes under a lot of negative pressure. Do you think ministers, where do you think we can make alliances with other people that have credibility in this era that I find shocking, so many years after the Scopes trial and other such things? Of this mistrust of experts and some of the things that Mr. Levitan was talking about.
Well, it's an excellent question, and it goes back to the point that I was making about the messenger being even more important than the message. And I think that I don't have a whole program to lay out, but I think that it is going to be really important to try to find and work with and recruit people who are credible in different communities, and whether those are business people or military people or ministers or farmers or whoever it might be, but talking simply, if the message can be right, but if the messenger's wrong, you can't cut through. And I wish that weren't true, but that's true.
Since I'm already on the doom and gloom beat, I will add that I think you're right that is an incredibly difficult issue right now. The mistrust or distrust of experts and expertise, And that is something that I think is relatively new. I will recommend 2 other books, one of which I have not read yet, but is about it's called The Death of Expertise, which I think just came out, and another one, The Twilight of the Elites. So the people have been thinking about this for sure. I don't know if there's a good answer to it because it seems to be getting worse. Certainly in the sorts of things that I cover, the responses to, well, this collection of experts says something have gotten worse. The people don't accept that, and they don't accept sort of what I think of as a hierarchy of sources. The fact that usually the New York Times is pretty trustworthy versus Breitbart. And so I'm not sure. I don't have an answer for you. I mean, it's definitely good points about other places to sort of make these alliances, I guess. The one positive I will say is that I think of all the science-related policies and efforts made during the Obama administration, one that is perhaps most likely to last are all the initiatives on STEM education. It's too popular to say no to destroy. It's just too, no one would say no to STEM education. And this is more of a long-term thing, which maybe doesn't quite work for climate because we do have a ticking clock here. But just increasing the overall science literacy in the country will obviously help this issue. And so this is maybe a bit down the road when those types of education initiatives sort of bear fruit. But that's my end on a high note kind of thing.
Just one quick other point. This is not a new phenomenon, and I would commend to you the writings of Walter Russell Mead on Jacksonian America. I do not commend to you, by the way, his recent column about climate change, which was misinformed. But he's very good on that, and the antagonism toward elites and towards science and knowledge has been with us in America for a long time.
I mean, I think it's a huge challenge as well, and I think there's a whole host of spokespeople that could be engaged. So it's less of finding that key one, but of course engaging all the faith leaders and farmers and everyone else. 2, to point out, I mean, 1, there's a desperate need for a populist, clean energy politician in this country, and even one of a slightly libertarian bent of who's saying, I want you to have the right to create your own power, to free yourself from these utilities. You should be able to put a solar panel on your house, and don't let them tell you can't. Because there are laws that need to be changed in places like Florida where you're not allowed to do that work. So we need those kind of muscular America, we can do this type folks out there doing that. So that's one place.
The Green Tea Party for a while.
The Green Tea Party, and actually there is, another event coming up after the climate march at the Newseum. I think at 3 p.m. Climate One, which is a great radio program out of San Francisco, is having a debate with our executive director, May Boovy, who's a great populist from California, liberal from California, and Debbie from the Green Tea Party, who's going to be there, and I think Senator Sheldon Whitehouse as well. So if you want to see some fireworks between the Tea Party and 350.org, that's a good place to go. At the Newseum, I think at 3, but if you look up Climate One, that should be it should show up. What I would say, though, is I wouldn't underestimate the value of neighbor-to-neighbor type work as well. I think that what we've found is we have supporters all across the country in all 50 states. And just relating to people as, I'm your neighbor and I care about this, and I care about the fact that there's a pipeline going through our community, and I think we can do better with renewables. You'd be surprised how far people get with that, actually. That it doesn't take being a minister or whatever it is, just relating to someone as saying, I live here too, and this is something I'm worried about, often does actually really work. So I wouldn't hesitate from trying to have the conversations, even if you don't feel like you have your conservative bona fides. There's a real way to still move things forward, to relate to people human to human, to try and get past the jargon and rhetoric and really move forward on these issues.
I just want to mention really quickly that among our partners, the March for Science, we're the National Farmers Union. So that's a great example of people coming together as a coalition to work on science issues. So, okay, next question.
I do have a question I've had for a long time. I've followed the geoengineering in the sky for 4 years. It is going on, and it's not just an experiment. It doesn't appear to be an experiment anymore. And you were basically saying it's just in an experimental stage. I'm just curious.
Well, I don't think actual geoengineering efforts are happening. I mean, it's of the sort of things that that Jamie was talking about.
Nanoparticles of things being sprayed in the sky. That's not true.
No, not yet. I mean, are people thinking about those sorts of things? Yes, but I think tiny mirrors in the sky or whatever the stuff that people
So the
talk
whole
about.
geoengineeringwatch.org is a farce.
Yes.
It is. Okay, I just was curious. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We have time for one last question.
You mentioned methane once as the second largest source. When we talk, all the horror scenarios have to do with carbon. All the horror scenarios have to do with carbon and the sea rising. But my understanding was that there's tons of methane locked in Siberia and in northern Canada, and all it will take is the Earth's average temperature to go up to release all that gas into the atmosphere. And I'm not quite sure what we do about that. What we can do about it is be really serious right now about preventing that 2-degree rise each whatever period of time it is. But once that methane gets released, the environmental consequences could be horrible, much more even than sea rise. So I'm just wondering what the thought is on that. What's the preventive strategy? Is there any?
I think you already said it. I think it's be serious now. I mean, you're absolutely right that the methane trapped in permafrost is a huge issue, and there are feedback loops associated with it as well that would sort of accelerate the process. So it's a very scary issue. The best thing to do is not let it escape, which would mean, very serious attempts to fulfill the goals of the Paris Agreement, and probably more so. I don't think that there's sort of a specific strategy. You can tell me if I'm wrong here, but I don't think there's a specific strategy related to keeping that methane in the ground beyond don't let the planet warm, because that's the thing that will release it.
Great. Well, thank you for that incredible set of questions. Thank you for coming out tonight. Do you have anything you want to say, John?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say to all of you, Kristen, Todd, Dave, and Jamie, you've given us a lot to think about. There's been some incredibly insightful discussion, and there's also a lot that's actionable. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you to the audience as well for asking such insightful conversations and being part of this conversation.
And we'll see you all again on Saturday in the street.
We'll see you all again
Thanks
on Saturday.
everybody
Thank
for
you.
coming.